We look at something like an iPhone, and it is a marvel, right? A technological marvel. It's far beyond things of yesteryear that were technological marvels. You look at a steam engine, it's complex, but you look at an iPhone and it's like mind-bogglingly complex. No one could pick up an iPhone or a smartphone of any kind and think that it was an accident, right? We know that thousands of people spent probably millions of hours on the different aspects of this, the different components that go into something like this. It might not be quite as obvious to a non-biologist how much more complex even a simple organism, a worm, a firefly is than a smartphone, but it's true. If you look at the inner workings of something as simple as, say, a firefly, you find that it's layer upon layer upon layer of complexity. All these things are very sophisticated in how they function. The mere fact that a firefly comes from a single cell that then develops into a firefly puts it in a completely different league. That doesn't happen with smartphones. Factories make smartphones. Fireflies come from fireflies, and they come from an initial fertilized cell. It's absolutely mind-boggling. We have no idea how a single cell produces an adult. These things are marvelous. And it's for that reason, I think, that Scripture keeps coming back to this idea of God challenging Job. Is it by your understanding that the hawk soars and spreads his wing to the south? And Job, when challenged with something like that, realizes, I said too much. I'll shut up and I'll let you speak. I uttered things which I did not understand.
Theistic evolution is a viewpoint that God created matter, and after that, God didn't guide or intervene or act directly to cause any empirically detectable change in the natural behavior of matter until all living things had evolved by purely natural processes.
It is the idea that God somehow set up the process at the beginning and then just let it run. That's sort of like deism. Or he was involved in the process of evolution as long as there can be no way to tell that he was involved.
There's several things at stake in the debate about theistic evolution. There's a key scientific issue at stake, there's a philosophical issue at stake, and there are theological issues at stake. Scientifically, the really odd thing about this debate is that at just the point when leading evolutionary biologists and evolutionary theorists are acknowledging that the main standard, orthodox, textbook theory of evolution, known as neo-Darwinism, is in serious trouble, we have Christians who are in the sciences, theologians, pastors saying we need to embrace Darwinian evolution lest we lose credibility in the secular world.
The whole claim of theistic evolution is that Christians need to get on the evolutionary bandwagon because the science is overwhelming. But the fact of the matter is, if you actually look at what's happening in the sciences, it's completely the other direction. There is an overwhelming amount of evidence now that standard neo-Darwinian evolution, the idea that random mutations and natural selection can explain everything, including us, it doesn't work. We know what evolution can do in the lab. We have experiments with bacteria, and it's not much.
The mechanisms that the theistic evolutionists propose are themselves demonstrably not creative. Natural selection explains the survival, but not the arrival of the fittest. It does a good job of explaining things like beaks getting a little bit bigger, a little bit smaller, adaptation to environmental change, but it doesn't do a good job of explaining where you get birds in the first place.
I also like to think of it as a circular argument because to get the first cell, you need DNA, and you also need RNA, and you need protein. You need DNA to make RNA to make protein, but you also need protein to make DNA. Coming up with that out of a process of random mutation and natural selection is just not possible.
There are certain philosophical assumptions that underlie the belief in theistic evolution. The first one is that science is by far a more authoritative source of knowledge of reality than is theology or any other field.
Those who have adopted the strong form of theistic evolution that we're critiquing have pretty much embraced and even defended methodological naturalism. Methodological naturalism is a convention that says we must formulate theories about the world as if it were true that nature acting on its own can produce everything that we see.
C.S. Lewis, near the end of his life, wrote a book about how a lot of developments in science actually follow not just the evidence, it follows our presuppositions and the things that we bring to nature. And he has this wonderful passage where he talks about that nature answers the questions that we ask her. And so if our preconceptions think that all that exists is just matter in motion, we're only looking for material explanations and we're excluding mind from the get-go. So we're going to get true but partial answers. Nature will give us those answers because that's the only thing we're looking for. His point is that if we have different preconceptions, if we're open to other ideas, we might get different answers from nature.
If we are really looking for truth, then it's not persuasive to rule out some kinds of causes before you consider the evidence.
The primary obligation of the scientists is to be truth-seeking. We want to have an open philosophy of science. The theistic evolutionists are content to limit the potential hypotheses under consideration to materialistic ones, and that's a big issue between us.
The thing that's at stake in theistic evolution, the debate about it, is our understanding of Scripture.
And it's sad to say, but theistic evolution actually undermines Christians' confidence in the authority of Scripture. The doctrine of creation and the general way that creation took place is at the very foundation of Christianity, that God created all life and that there was at least a certain discernible way He did it. Theistic evolution puts all that up for grabs. And as a result, it takes the core of theology and severs it from history. And so theology becomes placed in what Francis Schaeffer used to call the upper story, in an area where theology isn't really about facts. It certainly isn't about things we can test or know. It's more about beliefs and feelings. But science does the hard work. It's really about evidence and fact. If we keep revising the Bible when science tells us we have to, then at some point we're going to end up believing that the Bible may not really be a factual book in the first place.
The question is whether Christians will reject God's authority in whole areas of human knowledge, talking about where we came from and how we got here.
Do we take the latest scientific ideas or the textbook orthodoxy of the scientific community to be our ultimate authority? And if so, then we have to make everything conform to that, including our reading not only of Genesis, but the entire reading of Scripture. Whereas if we take Scripture to occupy a position of higher authority than the opinion of the scientific community, then we view things differently. It's not that we're rejecting science, it's that we recognize that science is not the ultimate authority.
One of the things that just disturbs me personally, having been immersed in this issue and the debate about biological origins for now over 30 years, is that there is a kind of uncritical acceptance of scientific authority that has affected the way the church understands its own doctrines. There's an unnecessary deference to scientific authority, in part because there is no consensus view right now, except that neo-Darwinism is failing. Last November in London, at the Royal Society, the largest, oldest, most august, authoritative scientific group in the world, there was a conference that was assessing the status of neo-Darwinian theory that was called by many evolutionary biologists who have become disenchanted with the theory. And we have leading people in evolutionary biology today saying that the modern form of Darwinian theory has now failed to account for the most important thing that any evolutionary theory must account for, which is where does the new form, the new biological structure come from? The answer essentially is we don't know. So it seems to me a very odd time for Christians who are concerned about the science-faith dialogue to be saying, well, we need to embrace the modern form of Darwinian theory, otherwise we're going to be out of date. It's just the opposite, in fact. Well, theistic evolution actually can be a number of different distinct ideas because the term evolution can have a number of distinct definitions. So if you think of the most basic definition of evolution as just being change over time, there are a couple different senses in which that's true. One is the idea that that organisms have, the organisms we see on Earth today are different than the ones that are attested in the fossil record. So we've seen change over time in that sense. We also see small-scale variation within the limits of a genome, for example, what's called microevolution. Again, another change over time. A good example of that might be the Galapagos finches, the beaks of which have gotten smaller and larger in response to varying weather conditions in the Galapagos, or the peppered moths whose wings went dark to light and dark again, or light to dark and dark, whatever. They changed back and forth between light and dark. Or antibiotic resistance. These are well-established, observable senses in which we've seen change over time. So that's a definition of evolution. You could conjoin with theism and say, well, God causes change over time. Nobody really disputes that idea. If Christians don't dispute the idea that God is causing change over time, biologists don't dispute the idea that change over time is happening, at least within limits, and has happened over time. So that's one sense of the term evolution, and one, therefore, corresponding sense of the term theistic evolution. Second idea of evolution is the idea that change over time has been continuous and gradual and has been occurring essentially without limits, so that the picture of biological history is best represented by Darwin's figure of the tree of life, that all the branches on the tree represent the forms of life we see today, and each one of those forms has arisen through slow, small, gradual changes, going back to one simple form at the very beginning, maybe the trunk or the root of that tree. So you start with a one-celled organism, and then that morphs and change, and incremental change accumulates over time, and it eventually causes a diversification of all the disparate forms of life we see today. So that's a theory of biological history, sometimes called monophyly, or one family, that everything's connected by common ancestry, and that's a second sense of evolution. And many theistic evolutionists are simply people who think that God caused that continuous and gradual change, and that everything is linked together, and that's the right picture of biological history. A third meaning of evolution corresponds to a third idea of theistic evolution, and that's probably the most contentious notion, and that's the idea that the process of natural selection and random mutation and other similarly undirected natural processes have produced all that change implied by the tree of life. And so that all the forms of life we see today are the result of this purely natural mechanism called natural selection and random mutation, and some others perhaps supplementing that, and that mechanism has been sufficient to produce all the forms of life we see today, that it's therefore creative, and that it also explains the appearance of design that all biologists recognize in living organisms. Richard Dawkins says that biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. And the key word for him is appearance. Things look designed, but they're not really designed because this purely naturalistic, unguided mechanism has produced that appearance or illusion. But that mechanism merely mimics the powers of a designing intelligence. It is not accomplishing the goals of an intelligence. It's not goal-driven or purpose-driven. So that third meaning of evolution is standard neo-Darwinian theory today. Almost all evolutionary biologists adhere to that idea that a purely natural process, natural selection, random mutation, and maybe some other evolutionary mechanisms have produced everything we see today. And theistic evolution embraces that mechanism as a creative process and then says, in some unspecified way, God is behind it or part of it or upholding it, or they may say that the mutation selection mechanism is God's means of creativity. So that would be the third meaning of evolution. Third meaning of evolution, third possible sense of theistic evolution.
Many people wonder, why can't theistic evolution be a viable option for Christians? And I think that's a big question, and one of the things we first need to say is, what do you mean by evolution? There are lots of different meanings of evolution, from just change over time to common ancestry to Darwin's idea that life was the product of an unguided process. And I think some of those things you can believe as a Christian and believe it consistently. Other things you can't. For me personally, I'm not troubled by the idea that the Earth and the universe is billions of years old. I think Christians have had different views on that throughout history, and I think that can be accommodated. I think that the idea that things change over time, just generically, sure, things can change over time. We can see that from the fossil record, that there are things that existed a long time ago that don't exist now. I don't think there are any Christians that I know of that think that natural selection isn't a real process and that you can't have small level changes within species. So I do think that there are some things that aren't problematic, but then you get to really the larger claim, which I think many Christians don't understand, that Charles Darwin, when he came up with his theory of evolution, it wasn't just a theory of guided evolution or development over time. He thought he was defeating the idea that nature showed evidence of design and purpose. He really did think that he had a designer substitute, that through natural selection, basically survival of the fittest, acting on these random variations in nature, you could get the appearance of design in nature without the need for a designer. And that's where I think that if you want to be a Christian or a faithful Jew or faithful monotheist, period, that there's a real problem there. That if you think that the idea of a creator is superfluous and that the evolutionary process, an unguided process, can replace the need for a creator, I don't see how you square that with traditional monotheism. And so I think that for me, makes it not viable. That's theologically. But then on the science side, I think the reason why theistic evolution isn't particularly viable is that the science itself is undercutting Darwinian claims. The science itself shows that natural selection acting on these random variations will get you some really small things. It's good at knocking out things, making complicated things less complicated, but it's not great at building new things. And so if you really think that this is a viable option, I'd say theistic evolution is not viable from the standpoint of theism and from theology and the Bible, but it's also not viable from the standpoint of science.
There are certain understandings of theistic evolution that are logically contradictory. There are some versions of it that aren't logically contradictory, but some are, and the most classic one is this. Evolution says that the development of life is a completely unguided process that is random and according to natural law, but there's no guiding it in any direction. There's no end point that this is moving toward. Well, theistic evolution accepts that. They accept the theory of evolution as an unguided process, but then they say, but God somehow guided the process. And that's why we're theistic evolutionists, because we want to hold that God guided the process. Well, you can't have a process that's guided and unguided at the same time. That is completely contradictory. Now, there are some who will say, well, no, we believe that the process was in fact guided by God, so it wasn't unguided. But if I'm going to be a good theistic evolutionist, I can't allow anything God did to be detectable. Because if we could detect what God did, then theistic evolution would lose to intelligent design, and we would have God's nose poking into science. And so those theistic evolutionists say, well, God guided the process as long as we can never tell what he did. I wonder if that's any different than saying that he didn't guide it in the first place.
First of all, the mechanisms that the theistic evolutionists propose are the means by which God created, are themselves demonstrably not creative. That's a big problem. It's just a scientific problem. Mutation and natural selection, for very many reasons, are now understood to have very limited creative power. In particular, they don't seem to be very good at generating novelty, new form, and the new information necessary to build it. They do a good job. These are true mechanisms. They really, nobody in our volume doubts that natural selection and random mutation or random variation is a genuine biological process. What we do doubt is that those mechanisms have the power to generate fundamentally new forms of life and even fundamentally new proteins, which are the smallest unit of innovation in the history of life. To build anything new in life, you've got to have new DNA code, which would produce a new protein fold. And for some technical reasons we go into in the book, we don't think that the Darwinian mechanism can generate novel protein structure. And we also, and many other scientists beyond the ones in this book, are questioning the idea that it can generate new biological form, new body plans, for example. So you hear lots of evolutionary biologists today saying things like natural selection explains the survival, but not the arrival of the fittest. It does a good job of explaining things like beaks getting a little bit bigger and a little bit smaller, adaptation to environmental change, but it doesn't do a good job of explaining where you get birds in the first place. So to attribute to that mechanism the creativity of the creator is scientifically problematic because the mechanism lacks creativity. Why would you say that's God's way of creating when the mechanism itself lacks creativity, and leading people in evolutionary biology today are providing very good reasons for doubting precisely that capacity of the mechanism?
I'm finding myself in the position of interacting with theistic evolutionists quite a bit. There's an online dialogue I'm having right now, in fact, with someone who takes a theistic evolution view. I would say, by way of advice, the first thing I would say to believers is don't judge these people as being not sincere in their faith or not sincere in their desire to embrace the truth. I think we all come at our interpretation of Scripture and our interpretation of science with preconceptions. We have things that we favor. We have a way of understanding the world, a worldview that we're bringing to our interpretation of things. And so be careful not to judge people for being human, because we're all human. I favor an approach where we don't try to make the argument for design be a high-level academic argument, but we bring it back down to what's obvious. So I prefer to argue from things that are obvious. And the reason for that is if you try, although, and I'm saying this as someone from an academic background who's done high-level work, arguing for design, working on proteins, at the end of the day, however much I say on that and publish on that, there will be other people with equal expertise to mine who will disagree. And if we portray this as something that's inherently an experts-only argument, then my side's going to lose as long as I'm outnumbered by people on the other side. I think you can do the technical work and show that evolution cannot work as advertised. Life cannot be an accident. God did make us. But I think the most potent argument is actually the basic, simple one. Look at what we see in life. Look at other things. You never see accidental causes do wonderful things, and life is the most wonderful thing.
The first thing at stake in the debate about theistic evolution, in my mind, is the truthfulness of the Bible, and in a broader sense, the authority of the Bible. The question is whether Christians will reject God's authority in whole areas of human knowledge, talking about where we came from and how we got here. Our friends who hold to theistic evolution seem to me to be saying, no, we won't listen to anything the Bible says about that topic, about where we came from and how we got here. It's poetry, it's allegory, it's ancient Near Eastern myth. God can't tell us about how He created us because that's the realm of science, not the realm of Scripture. So what is at stake here is the authority of the Bible to speak to whatever area of life that God decides to speak to us about, including the authority of the Bible if God decides to speak to us about the origin of the human race and how we came to be.
It's extremely important to realize that the idea that science alone produces true knowledge is very dangerous, and here's why. We give people authority to act in public because we assume they have the relevant knowledge. Dentists cannot put their hands in our mouths, but not insurance salesmen, because the dentist, we assume, doesn't just have a bunch of very deep emotional beliefs about molars. We assume that he actually knows something about molars. And so we give people the right to write our contracts, to sell houses, to operate on us, and so on, because we attribute to them not a bunch of beliefs, but knowledge of the relevant subject. If you limit knowledge to science, then all of the important questions of life, is there a God? Is there a soul? Is there life after death? Is there right and wrong? And what is right and what is wrong? What should the state do and what should be out of bounds for the state to do? Who ought I vote for? What should education be like? These are all questions that can't be answered by science because they're ought questions, normative questions. What that means is, if science is the sole source of knowledge we have of reality, All the things that matter to us most are left in the area of emotion, and it will turn out then that the makeup man is more important than the speechwriter.
Methodological naturalism is a convention that has really only been around since the late 19th century. Science actually got started in a very explicitly theistic and indeed Christian milieu. The period of time that historians call the scientific revolution is roughly 1300 to 1700. There's debate about when it actually starts and how much the Protestants versus the Catholics were responsible, but clearly theological ideas, Christian theological ideas, had a huge role in the formation of and the foundation of modern science. One of those key ideas was actually the idea of intelligibility, that nature is intelligible. There's an order and a design that can be understood and discerned by the scientist because nature is the product of a rational mind, a rational intellect, namely the mind of God, and that same mind or creator who made nature with that rational order built into it made us and our reason so that we could perceive and understand the reason that he built into nature. And that was what gave people confidence to do the hard work of investigation to figure out, well, what is the hidden order? What is the design that is beneath the appearances in natural phenomena? So the first thing to say is that science did not arise because of a set of naturalistic presuppositions. It actually arose because of a conviction that there was a lawful order in nature, that human beings could discern and understand it because they'd been made in the image of the creator of that order, and that also they needed to go investigate because while they might expect that there's a rational order there, the Greeks believed the same, they also knew that the rational order was contingent on the choice of the creator. This was a product of recovering the doctrine of creation in the late Middle Ages. And since the order in nature is contingent on the act of the creator, we have to go and look and see what kind of an order he put into it. We can't just simply sit in our armchairs and deduce it from logical first principles. The Greeks and the Ptolemaic astronomy was a good example of this. They figured that, well, since the most perfect form of motion is a circle, and since the planets are in the heavenly realm, they must be inscribing circular orbits, but in fact they were doing ellipses. So the early modern scientists broke with the ancient Greeks and said, since nature's created by God and he could have done otherwise, we need to go and find out not what he must have done, as Robert Boyle said, but what he did do, which means empirical investigation. You got to look and see. So there were a number of ways in which Christianity gave rise to modern science, and the idea that a set of naturalistic assumptions is necessary to do science, I think is just historically false.
I see no conflict whatsoever between Christian theology, Christian belief, and empirical science, that is, science that's based on evidence. I'm a scientist. I'm also a theologian. I see no conflict there. The conflict is not with evidence. The conflict is with a materialistic story, in this case neo-Darwinism, that masquerades as empirical science. So the main point of neo-Darwinism is not the evidence, it's not based on evidence. The main point is to argue that we are accidents, and that to me is materialistic philosophy, not empirical science. And so I would say Christians have no reason to fear science at all.
On the question of how long it would take for something new to occur by an evolutionary means, we zeroed in on the very smallest level, which is a single gene producing a single protein molecule that folds up and does something useful inside a cell. And I zeroed in on this as a graduate student and decided I was going to do my postdoc on this question because I saw here's where you can actually go in the lab and measure the probabilities, and you could do the math and find out how long it would take for something like this to evolve. Whereas if you look at a whole organism, that's way beyond, we can't get the numbers. It's way too complicated. So I and a number of colleagues, Ann Gager one of them, have spent years in the lab looking at how constrained the sequences are, the individual gene sequences, in order to make enzymes that work. And it turns out they're highly constrained. The amino acids have to be in a special order in order for the chains that are made inside the cells to fold up and to function. You can change these amino acids and still have a functional enzyme, but it turns out you can't change them very far. You certainly can't change them willy-nilly. There's a very tight constraint on what they need to be in order for these sequences to work. So the question we've asked is, suppose you've got genes that produce certain proteins that work, how hard would it be to evolve through just normal physical processes a new version of the gene that does some other function? And it turns out that if you need to make more than just a few, really two in most organisms, you're already beyond the probabilistic resources of evolution. You're already beyond the point where something could happen by accident that would make that transition. And we have studied a particular A to B transition where it appears that it's way more than two that are needed. We never did get it to work. Obviously, it could work. If you did hundreds of changes to A, you could turn it into B, and then it clearly would perform the function of B. But we were asking, can you get that sort of transition with just one or two? And you can't. And once you get beyond two, you get stuck. And that's even more true in higher life. So if you look at humans having supposedly evolved from the great apes, there you have much, much smaller populations, way fewer organisms than in bacteria, where you have billions and billions and billions, and you have much longer lifespans, and you have to come up with more sophisticated things. We differ from chimps in more profound ways than different bacteria differ from each other. So in all these respects, the problems that we find in the lab on single genes that work in bacteria only point to far greater problems when you look at higher and higher things, like the origin of humanity.
You can find molecular motors inside the cell that look just like motors that we would build. The ribosome is a motor. There are videos of it that have been computer generated, and you can watch it chug along. Chug, 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 and it spits out amino acids and links them together. Then there's another one called the flagellum, which is a little rotary motor embedded in the membrane of a bacterium. It looks just like an inboard motor on a boat. It has the same sorts of parts. It has bearings, it has stators, it has the motor itself, it has a propeller attached. It can spin at speeds much faster than anything we can make, average about 10,000, but up to 100,000 RPMs. It can stop, turn on a dime, literally in a quarter turn. It responds to information the cell receives about where the food is and what direction to swim. That is an amazing structure, and it looks like a machine, so we think of it as a machine. And you don't get machines from random mutation and natural selection, because you need the whole thing with all of its parts in order for it to function. If you take away one part, it's broken.
The single strongest argument in favor of intelligent design is that things live and they work. If I just said to you this iPhone happened by accident, I was walking on an iron range in northern Minnesota after a lightning storm, and I picked it up, and here, look what had happened, you would laugh at me. But the iPhone is not nearly as complex as the human body or as living things generally. It took an intelligent designer to plan this, and the powerful work of many extremely intelligent scientists to make this iPhone work. Well, how can we think that something even more complex than this happened because of chance or randomness or accident? Randomness just doesn't explain the complexity of living things. Things work, things live. That is an argument in favor of intelligent design, in my mind.
Theory of intelligent design says there are certain features of biological systems that are best explained by a designing intelligence, an actual designing intelligence, rather than an undirected process that merely mimics the the activity of a designing intelligence. So instead of having apparent design in biology, intelligent design argues that there are features of living systems that are the result of actual design, an actual intelligent agent. So in that sense, it's the contrary view to the third meaning of evolution, which wants to say that things look designed, but they're not really designed. We have the appearance of design, but not the reality of design. Intelligent design is saying, no, there is real design in the sense that there are features of living systems that were produced through the activity of a designing agent.
There are actually ways that certain scientific assumptions can impede the scientific search for truth. One of those assumptions is that the only kind of cause that we can discover for an effect we're trying to understand is a purely physical, natural cause. But among other things, this is going to leave out human agency. Sometimes a person creates an effect or does it intentionally, and the cause is their own free will and their own mental life. It's not a physical thing at all. And so by always having to find some brain cause, you reduce the role of the agent, and certain aspects of psychology that focus on the agent are set aside in favor of brain research. Now, it should be a both and, but if it's only the brain, you're in trouble. Similarly, when you're simply searching for purely physical causes, what would become of archaeology? If I have to find a natural cause for pottery or for an arrowhead, that would be ridiculous. Surely I can look for a personal cause for those things, but why not biology? What if the biological evidence or the paleontological evidence is best explained by the actions of an intelligent being? The assumption of science does not allow for that kind of explanation, and consequently it has a straitjacket on it that keeps it from being able to advance as widely as it could.
The extended synthesis is the name for a whole range of new proposals that have been made by leading evolutionary biologists who, on the one hand, recognize that neo-Darwinism is inadequate, that the mutation natural selection mechanism does not generate new form and new biological information. And on the other, biologists who want to hold on to a strictly materialistic or naturalistic approach to solving the problem. So they're proposing other materialistic evolutionary mechanisms to try to supplement the perceived and increasingly agreed limitations or liabilities of the mutation selection mechanism. So the extended synthesis the terminology is based on, it's a variation on the old idea that neo-Darwinism was a synthesis of Mendelian genetics and classical Darwinian theory. And that in the 1930s and 40s was called the new synthesis. So the extended synthesis is new evolutionary mechanisms that are being kind of bolted on to the old neo-Darwinian theory. In our book, we have a whole chapter on these proposals. And we show that some of the proposals are really quite interesting, and that they definitely describe biological mechanisms that neo-Darwinism has given to which neo-Darwinism has given short shrift. They're not things that the Darwinists talk about much. But the problem we've found with each of these new proposals is that they don't account for the origin of the information necessary to build new forms of life either. And typically they end up either not addressing the problem of biological information, or they simply or they will end up begging the question. They'll explain the origin of new form by presupposing pre-existing unexplained sources of information. Let me give you an example. There's a brilliant scientist at the University of Chicago named James Shapiro. He gave one of the best talks at the conference in November of 2016 at the Royal Society in London. He has a new model he calls natural genetic engineering. And what he points out is that the mutations that we see taking place in nature very often are not random at all. They're not random with respect to the survival needs of the organism. Rather, they are in some way produced by guided mechanisms that are that reflect a kind of pre-programmed adaptive capacity. So if an organism is under some sort of environmental stress, that triggers a response that either expresses some pre-existing genetic information or ramps up mutational processes in certain designated parts of the genome. And these are not random responses at all. They're under what he calls algorithmic control. So you have a pre-programmed adaptive response to an environmental stress that produces a change, an evolutionary change that allows the organism to survive under certain conditions. Very cool, very interesting biology. But there's a big question that Shapiro doesn't address, and that is, where does the pre-programming come from? Because that original pre-programming implies that there's an informational endowment. An algorithm is a computer program. So there's information already in the cell that's telling the cell how to respond to these environmental stressors. And what we want to know is, where does that information come from? Shapiro doesn't answer that question. Therefore, his model, as interesting as it is, as accurate as it is in describing some biological processes that have been overlooked, does not answer the ultimate origins question, particularly the question of the origin of information. And each of the models in the new synthesis, or the new mechanisms in the new synthesis, have that kind of a problem. They describe interesting biology, but presuppose the origin of the information necessary for those processes to occur.
Okay, we look at something like an iPhone, and it is a marvel, right? A technological marvel. It's far beyond things of yesteryear that were technological marvels. You look at a steam engine, it's complex, but you look at an iPhone and it's like mind-bogglingly complex. No one could pick up an iPhone or a smartphone of any kind and think that it was an accident, right? We know that thousands of people spent probably millions of hours on the different aspects of this, the different components that go into something like this. It doesn't happen by accident. It might not be quite as obvious to a non-biologist how much more complex even a simple organism, a worm, a firefly, is than a smartphone, but it's true. If you look at the inner workings of something as simple as, say, a firefly, you find that it's layer upon layer upon layer of complexity. All these things are very sophisticated in how they function. The mere fact that a firefly comes from a single cell that then develops into a firefly puts it in a completely different league. That doesn't happen with smartphones. Factories make smartphones. Fireflies come from fireflies, and they come from initially an initial fertilized cell. It's absolutely mind-boggling. I think a lot of non-scientists think or assume that biologists have understood this, have plumbed the depths of biology and understand that DNA is the blueprint for making organisms, and it's actually not true. We don't understand this. We understand little bits of it. We don't understand what a genome is doing. We have no idea how a single cell produces an adult. These things are marvelous. And it's for that reason, I think, that Scripture keeps coming back to this idea that God challenging Job is that by your understanding that the hawk soars and spreads his wing to the south. And Job, when challenged with something like that, realizes, I said too much. I'll shut up and I'll let you speak. I'm uttered things which I did not understand. Paul in Romans 1 saying that everyone is without excuse. We cannot deny God because we've seen his handiwork, and through the things that he's made, we all know that he's there and that he's marvelous.
The origin of life is the single strongest argument against theistic evolution, without question. They have no answer for how it would be possible for the first cell to come into being. I also like to think of it as a circular argument because to get the first cell, you need DNA, and you also need RNA, and you need protein. You need DNA to make RNA to make protein, but you also need protein to make DNA. And nobody has an explanation for how that would have come into being. RNA might have been the beginning if evolution is true, but there's no way to come up with replication of DNA and the process of translating DNA into protein. It is an amazing process. The code that's used by cells to translate DNA into protein is a digital code. It's remarkable in its sophistication. It requires not only a way to copy the DNA into RNA, which requires a whole series of proteins, but it also requires a transfer, some way to switch from the language of RNA into protein. And there's a special apparatus that does all of that. Coming up with that out of a process of random mutation and natural selection, you can't bootstrap yourself into a cell. It's just not possible.
People often wonder why Christians should care about the evolution debate, specifically also referring to human beings, but even just more generally. Well, surveys show that 7 in 10 atheists and 4 in 10 agnostics say that for them personally, unguided chemical and biological evolution has made the existence of God less likely. Another huge proportion of people say that evolution means that human beings are not fundamentally unique or special. So you may not think this matters. You may think that you can just ignore the debate, but it's mattering to a lot of people in culture, to people who are losing faith, to people who think that humans aren't special, that grass or insects or apes are just as important as human beings. It's impacting them. It's impacting your neighbors, your friends, your family members, and your kids.
In my view, the single strongest argument against theistic evolution is that the information in living things and the overwhelming complexity of that information could not have been generated by natural laws and random processes given a 4 billion-year-old Earth and a 16 billion-year-old universe. In fact, the atheist Thomas Nagel recently wrote a book called Mind and Cosmos, and he said there are at least 2 things that atheists and Darwinists simply cannot explain. And the first is the origin of life from non-living matter. It's impossible to ask me to believe, he said, that could happen by natural law and random chance. And the second is from that first cell, the overwhelming development of staggeringly diverse beings that are highly complicated. You ever looked at the human brain? That thing's complicated. And Nagel said, I can't bring myself to believe that could happen by Darwinian processes and natural law. He says, I hope I don't have to appeal to the God hypothesis because I don't want there to be a God. He says that in his own book. I don't want to live in a universe where there's a cosmic authority. But at this point, I'm stuck and I'm looking for options.
I think everyone who's a believer should care about the question of origins, because if you think about it, where we came from really tells us who we are. If you ask who are we as humans, you're really asking how did we get here as humans, and you're asking where are we going? And the answer to the question where did we come from informs those other 2 things. It tells us who we are as humans, and it tells us where we're going. And the 2 polar opposites here are, one answer might be that we came from material processes that did not conceive of us. We are cosmic accidents. If that's the case, then we think of ourselves very differently. And we think of how we should live very differently. And we think of where we're going very differently. The alternative, polar opposite, is that we are created in the image of God by God as a personal God creating persons in his image. And that means something totally different in terms of who we are, how we live our lives, and where we're going.
If Christians continue to revise biblical truth claims in light of contemporary scientific theories, then this eventually lowers their respect for the real truth claims of the Bible. Because they say to themselves, well, look, if we had to revise the Bible about this topic, about creation, or in favor of theistic evolution, well, then why shouldn't I revise my views about the soul not being needed, because we find out that the brain has replaced the soul? Well, then why not revise my views about the morality of homosexuality, or about a traditional family, or about the sacredness of the unborn? In fact, why shouldn't I revise my views about God, whoever she is, or they are? Because nobody can really know. How do I know that? Well, the Bible constantly has to be revised to keep up with modern knowledge, and that sort of gives me the impression that it really can't be known to be true in the first place. So maybe what I should do is just retreat to blind faith, where I ultimately determine what I believe and what I don't believe, and it isn't the Bible that's my authority, I am.
Theistic evolution is a viewpoint that God created matter, and after that, God didn't guide or intervene or act directly to cause any empirically detectable change in the natural behavior of matter until all living things had evolved by purely natural processes. But what that belief implies is that there are actually 12 details in Genesis 1 to 3 that simply didn't happen. If you hold to theistic evolution in this most common form in which it is held today, you would say, for instance, number 1, that Adam and Eve were not the first human beings, and perhaps Adam and Eve never even existed. Number 2, you would say that Adam and Eve were born from human parents. Number 3, a theistic evolutionist would say God didn't act directly or specially to create Adam out of dust from the ground. And number 4, God didn't act directly to create Eve from a rib taken from Adam's side. Number 5, our friends who hold to theistic evolution would say Adam and Eve were never sinless human beings. And number 6, they would say Adam and Eve didn't commit the first human sins because human beings were doing morally evil things long before Adam and Eve existed. And number 7, human death did not begin as a result of Adam's sin because human beings existed long before Adam and Eve, and they were always subject to death. Number 8, if you hold to theistic evolution, you would hold that not all human beings have descended from Adam and Eve, for there were thousands of other human beings on the earth at the time that God chose 2 of them and called them Adam and Eve. Number 9, this belief would hold that God did not directly act in the natural world to create different kinds of fish and birds and land animals. And number 10, that God did not rest from his work of creation or stop any special creative activity after plants, animals, and human beings appeared on the earth. Number 11, a theistic evolution advocate would say God never created an originally very good natural world in the sense of a world that was a safe environment, free of thorns and thistles and other similar harmful things. And then finally, number 12, a believer in theistic evolution would say that after Adam and Eve sinned, God did not place any curse on the world that changed the workings of the natural world and made it more hostile to mankind. So that's 12 events in Genesis 1 to 3 that the Bible records as historically accurate, truthful events, but that are denied by advocates of theistic evolution.
It's a common misconception that if there were in fact billions of years for life to evolve, that the length of that time, which is mind-bogglingly long, few of us live to 100 years, right? So this is much, much longer, that the earth has been around and that life has been around. It's a common misconception that somehow takes care of the improbability of life happening accidentally. Most of us are not mathematically inclined, so we don't know how to do the math of probabilities, and we don't know how to find out whether 5 billion years is plenty of time for a firefly to happen by accident. It turns out if you do the math, you find out that billions of years is nowhere close to being enough time for these things to happen by accident. There isn't enough matter in the universe or time in the universe for anything like life to have happened by accident. I argue, actually, you don't need to do the math because we all intuit this automatically anyway. The 4-year-old's not doing probability calculations when he or she looks at a butterfly and knows that that was made by God. And yet they're right. It turns out that the sort of coincidence that would be needed for something like that to happen by accident, a living thing to happen by accident, is so far beyond the sorts of coincidences that actually do happen. We see coincidences happen, it's a real thing, but they're very, very minor. And when we look at something living, we know that this is way beyond what could happen by chance.
It's important that we believe in a historical Adam and Eve for several reasons, but one is the Bible presents the story of Adam and Eve as a historical narrative. It reports this as literature telling events that actually happened. Several reasons indicate that. First, the story of Adam and Eve is placed at the beginning of the Bible. It's a story that is embedded in the narrative of how the universe came into being, where the sun and moon and stars came from, where the planets came from, where the waters and the land on earth came from, where the fish came from, where the animals came from, and ultimately where human beings came from. The whole initial narrative of the Bible is a story of the origins of living things. And that shows an indication that this is an explanation of how these various things began, including an explanation of how the human race began. Then that impression is reinforced by the fact that the story of Adam and Eve is tied into later chapters in the Bible with genealogies and names, so that Adam and Eve had children. They had Cain and Abel, and then Seth's descendants are listed. And later in Genesis, those who descended from Seth are also listed, and so the human race progresses. So the Genesis 1 to 3 is tied in the narrative to later historical events, going on to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, etc. Then there's a literary feature. In Genesis 2:4, in the ESV, it says, "These are the generations of the heavens and the earth." But some translations say this is the account of, but in Hebrew there's an expression that is repeated 11 times in Genesis. These are the generations of, these are the generations of, and it structures the whole book of Genesis, going all the way to the story of Jacob and Jacob's 12 sons, so that is, of course, real history, the origin of the nation of Israel and the 12 tribes. But that structure, these are the generations of, ties the entire book together as clearly a historical narrative. Then you go later in the Old Testament, and the book of 1 Chronicles. If you've ever read Chronicles, you know it's just long chapters of lists of names. But where does it start? It starts with Adam and then Seth, and goes forward from there till you get into the detailed history of the people of Israel. There are other arguments from the Hebrew syntactical structure that would indicate that this is intended as historical narrative. I won't go into those at this point, but there's another argument, and that is when we go to the New Testament views Adam and Eve as real historical people. In fact, when I researched this, I found 10 New Testament books that treat Adam and Eve as historical people. For instance, in Matthew 19, Jesus says, "He who created them from the beginning," that's an allusion to Genesis 1, "he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." That's quoting Genesis 2. So Jesus alludes to Genesis 1, he quotes Genesis 2, and he takes it as a historical narrative. We go over to the book of Luke, and Luke traces the genealogy of Jesus all the way back to the son of Enos, the son of Seth, the son of Adam, the son of God. In other words, in Luke 3, Luke is tracing the genealogy of the human race all the way back to Adam, who was the son of no human being, but the son directly of God. Paul, when he's speaking to Greek philosophers on the Areopagus in Athens, says in Acts 17, God made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth. And elsewhere, Paul calls Adam the one man in the book of Romans, for instance. So Paul is talking about Adam and saying that every nation of mankind has descended from Adam. Adam is taken as historical. 1 Corinthians 15:45, Paul says, "The first man, Adam, became a living being." And so Adam is called the first man, understood as historical. So there is abundant evidence that Genesis 1 to 3 should be understood as truthful historical narrative. There's another reason why it's important to insist on the historicity of Adam and Eve as they are represented in Genesis 1 to 3, and that is the truthfulness of the Bible itself is at stake. If we deny the factual history of Adam and Eve as reported in Genesis 1 to 3, we're denying the truthfulness of a major section of the Bible, and I think that's really denying the inerrancy of Scripture, which is a major doctrinal deviation. But that's not all. These first 3 chapters of the Bible are tremendously important. They are chapters that provide the historical foundation for the rest of the Bible and for the entirety of the Christian faith. So this means that the debate over creation and evolution is really a debate about the validity of several major Christian doctrines for which these 3 chapters are foundational. When you think about it, in Genesis 1 to 3, the Bible teaches essential truths about the activity of God in creation, the origin of the universe, the creation of plants and animals on the earth, the origin and unity of the human race, the creation of manhood and womanhood, the origin of marriage, the origin of human sin and human death, and the origin of man's need for redemption from sin. Without the foundation laid down in those 3 chapters, the rest of the Bible would make no sense, and many of those doctrines would be undermined or lost. And so I think it's no exaggeration to say that these 3 chapters are essential to the rest of the Bible.
It's an odd thing to say, but theistic evolution actually contributes to the disdain among non-believers towards Christian truth claims. There was a professor at a major university who was an atheist, and he was asked by Crew's leadership organization, what do you atheist professors expect out of Christian professors? And he said, we expect them to stand up for what they believe, not to back off, not to be cowards, but just assert honestly and fairly what it is they believe and why. Now, if you are taking a compromising position and you're obviously giving up what the church has held for 2,000 years about a whole host of issues, unbelievers are going to look at that and they're going to say, you know what, Christian thinkers don't really believe their Bible's true after all. They hope it is, but they're so willing to give up their beliefs that I wonder if what they really do believe about the Bible. I mean, every time science says something, all the theologians are looking for the nearest foxhole. So Christians are a bunch of knuckleheads, and all they have at the end of the day is blind faith. And I know that because of their attitude. When they come into interaction with science, they always wave the white flag.
The importance of believing in a historical fall of Adam and Eve is seen when we ask the question, who is to blame for the evil in the world today, for the sin and suffering and death that exists? If we believe in the biblical story of the fall, then Adam and Eve are responsible. They sinned, they disobeyed God, and they brought the punishment of sin and death into the world. And that's why suffering and death exist today in the world, but this is not how God created us to be. And so God is not to be blamed. But if you hold to theistic evolution, then you think that the world as it is the way it always has been. And in other words, this is the best that God could do by allowing evolution to run its course. And that runs dangerously close to blaming God for sin and suffering and death in the world, something that the Bible never wants us to do. The other reason that it's important to believe in a historical fall is that the New Testament connects Adam's sin to our salvation in Christ. And someone might argue, if Paul was wrong about the entire human race descending from Adam, as the theistic evolution advocates would say, he perhaps was also wrong about all human beings inheriting a common sin nature from Adam. And therefore, Paul could well be wrong about our gaining forgiveness and righteousness through our representation by Christ. It's unmistakable how Paul explicitly connects representation by Adam and representation by Christ. This is what Paul says in Romans 5. For if because of one man's trespass death reigned through that one man, that's Adam, much more will those who receive the abundance of grace and the free gift of righteousness reign in life through the one man, Jesus Christ. And then he goes on to say, for as by one man's disobedience the many were made sinners, so by the one man's obedience the many will be made righteous. So there's a clear parallel between representation by Adam and representation by Christ. If we don't have a historical fall and a historical Adam, then maybe Paul was wrong about representation by Christ as well. And so the entire doctrine of the atonement and our forgiveness of sins through Christ is undermined.
Many people seem to think that C.S. Lewis embraced modern evolutionary theory wholesale, and that he was perfectly happy with it, thought it was consistent with Christianity, and believed in it. And I've read a lot of things by people who seem to say that. The interesting thing is, if you actually read Lewis, both his public writings and his private writings, is he was really rather skeptical of many claims made in the name of evolution. And he became even more skeptical the older he got. And so by the end of his life, he was really skeptical. And so Lewis really was not someone who just wholesale endorsed modern evolutionary theory. And I think to sort of see this, we need to look at two particular aspects of evolution that Lewis thought about and wrote about. First is the idea of common ancestry, the idea that everything that lives, including human beings, basically originated as a descendant with modification from one original ancestor. Now, Lewis did not have a theological objection to common ancestry. He thought God could have used pre-human animals to create particularly the physical aspects of human beings. Now, that doesn't mean he thought that God did do that. Actually, if you read his especially private writings and correspondence, he was heavily skeptical of that idea and got really skeptical later in life, in the last few years of his life. It's also the case that the type of common ancestry that Lewis thought could fit with Christianity is not the type of common ancestry that really modern evolutionary theory teaches. One, Lewis thought that the original human beings did have to be morally innocent, and that there was a real fall in nature, and that had consequences. And many people who call themselves theistic evolutionists, this is a real problem for them. They regard the fall as a myth, and actually think that, if anything, it was a fall upward, that we were sinful and evil to begin with because evolution is based on selfishness and based on the struggle for survival, and that somehow through self-awareness we later became aware of God. Well, that doesn't fit the biblical account at all, and Lewis said that the type of common ancestry he was willing to accept wouldn't accept that. That, in fact, you would have to have the first humans be genuinely in moral fellowship with God and then make a choice to basically turn away from God, and then there are all sorts of repercussions for that. Lewis also insisted, pretty much in his private life at least, that he believed in a historic Adam and Eve. Now, he did actually say in some of the things he wrote publicly that he wouldn't insist on that theologically, but he privately did believe in a historic Adam and Eve, at least from his private correspondence and from his own fictional books, and the way he wrote about it, it's pretty clear that he did believe in a historic Adam and Eve. And then he also was very clear that an evolutionary process, particularly a materialistic evolutionary process, a mindless process, could not explain the development of the human mind and human morality. And again, that's something that modern evolutionary theory claims to explain. And so although Lewis did say that he thought Christians could believe in a type of common ancestry, he sharply limited what he meant by common ancestry. So that's one main evolutionary claim. But the other one is really the more particularly Darwinian claim. It's that the process of evolution, the thing that brought about you and me and everything in nature, was a blind and unguided process. The whole thing about natural selection, according to Darwin, is that it can mimic an intelligent designer without actually needing a designer at all. That if you just have survival plus these random variations in nature, that you could create everything, build everything without the need for intentional design. Lewis, even from the time before he was a Christian, during World War I, while he was still an atheist and agnostic, thought that natural selection couldn't do all those things. It just didn't make any sense, and the evidence didn't show it. And certainly after he became a Christian, he became even more skeptical of natural selection. Now, he thought it could do things like knock out things and make things less complicated, but he was very skeptical of the idea that Darwinian natural selection, an unguided process, could build new form and function. And so he was very clear on that. And so, Lewis did think, again, that there could be a type of common ancestry that a Christian could believe if you really sharply defined it in a way that modern evolutionists wouldn't find acceptable. But then when it came to natural selection as an unguided process, he was sharply critical of that, just on evidentiary grounds, even before he was a Christian. And then, of course, as a Christian, if you believe that God is sovereign, then there are a whole realm of other problems with that.
A God of the gaps argument is an argument that has a formal logical structure that in logic is known as an argument from ignorance. It's an informal fallacy, and arguments from ignorance have the following form. If I say cause A is not sufficient to produce effect X, and then I say therefore cause B must have produced X, but I have no independent evidence that cause B can produce X, then I've committed a fallacy of arguing from ignorance. Because just because A isn't sufficient to produce the effect in question doesn't mean that some other cause did it. You have to have independent evidence that that other cause is capable of doing it. And that then becomes a God of the gaps argument when you say, well, various natural processes aren't sufficient to produce, say, the origin of the first life or the origin of the first animals in the history of life. And then if I were to say, therefore God did it, that would be a God of the gaps argument. It would be an argument from ignorance. But that's not how we're arguing when we make the case for intelligent design, because we're adding an additional premise. We're saying that various kinds of natural processes are not sufficient to produce the origin of new functional information. And we're specifically dialed into the presence of the digital code that's stored in the DNA molecule that performs important biological functions. It's information in a very specific technical sense. So we say, we show that various natural processes are insufficient to produce these large infusions of information we see arising in the history of life that are necessary to build new forms of life. But then we point out from observation of the world around us that we do know of a cause that does produce information. We have independent evidence that intelligent agency, that mind, that creative intelligence can generate information. You and I are doing it right now as we're talking. We're trading notes, trading information. So information is, in our experience, a mind product. We have independent experience that minds produce information. And so when we infer an intelligent agent as having acted in the past based on the presence of digital code stored in the macromolecules of life, we're not arguing from ignorance. We're arguing from our knowledge of cause and effect, and specifically what we know minds can do, namely produce information that merely undirected material processes can't.
There's a simple question that I could ask if someone is saying, I can't read all this literature on theistic evolution and the historicity of Genesis 1. I'm so confused by the abundance of literature, I don't know what to believe. And I would just ask this simple question. Do you think that God caused the history of the beginning of the world to be written in such a way that you can understand it? Or do you think he caused it to be written in such a way that only highly trained scientists in the 21st century could understand what it was really intended to tell us? Well, I think that it was written so that ordinary readers throughout history could have a pretty good idea of what Genesis 1-3 means and how it tells us where all living things came from. Another way of putting that is to say, do you think that God wanted to explain to people where the world came from and where plants and animals came from and where we came from as human beings? It is important to recognize what is actually happening here. Proponents of theistic evolution are claiming, in essence, that there are whole areas of human knowledge about which they will not allow the Bible to speak with authority. They will allow the Bible to speak to us about salvation, but not about the origin of all living things on the earth, not about the origin of human beings, the origin of moral evil in the human race, the origin of human death, the origin of natural evil in the world, the perfection of the natural world as God originally created it, and even the nature of Christ's own personal involvement as the creator of all things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, as Colossians 1:16 says. These are massive areas of human knowledge affecting our outlook on our entire lives. Yet theistic evolution has decreed that the Bible cannot authoritatively speak to us about these areas of human knowledge. These topics are the exclusive domain of modern naturalistic scientists, and they are off limits for God to speak to us about. But do Christians today really want to accept a theory that decrees that God is not allowed to speak to us about these vast areas of human knowledge? The appropriate response to such a claim would seem to be God's challenge to Job. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding.
I don't think Christians need a science degree to be confident in their sense that life had to have been created by God. And my book, Undeniable, is really making that point. It starts with the fact that's widely acknowledged that young people from a very early age get this. They look at living things and they know that they were designed by a godlike designer. Obviously, as they continue in their education, these young people are being told that that intuition is false and that the true understanding is the Darwinian understanding, or the modern version of the Darwinian understanding. But I want to take it back to the basic common sense view, which I call it common science. It's basically what we see and what we experience in life, and we never see accidental causes doing remarkable things. And life is it's more remarkable than anything that we've done in technology. Your smartphone is not nearly as sophisticated or elegant as a Firefly. If we stay with what's simple and obvious, we actually have a more potent argument than if we try to read up on things that are not really our specialty and we try to duke it out online with people who really are not interested in the truth. They're just trying to uphold a particular worldview. So I prefer to keep it simple, actually.
There are explanations of Genesis 1-3 that don't hold to a young earth. By that, I mean that there are some Christians who think that the days in Genesis are 24-hour days. That's a respectable, widely held opinion. And that means that they believe that the earth is maybe 10,000 years old, but not very old. And then there are others who hold to an old earth position, and that is they would say that Genesis 1, especially Genesis 1, the days in Genesis 1, maybe millions of years long, or maybe they were 24-hour days with millions of years between each one, but that would allow for an earth that's over 4 billion years old, an old earth position. In this book that I helped to edit called Theistic Evolution, a scientific, philosophical, and theological critique, we decided we would not take any position on the question of the age of the earth, whether it's an old earth or a young earth, because we know that there are Christians who hold to both positions. That's a different question than the question of theistic evolution. There, the question is whether the events of Genesis 3 are historical narrative that we should believe as truthful, not how long the individual days are or whether there were long periods of time between them. That's a separate question from whether Genesis 1-3 is historically true.
This is not true of all theistic evolutionists, but theistic evolutionists who take seriously the idea that God is not directing the mutation selection process, then think about that very rationally and say, well, if God's not guiding the process, then God doesn't really know where it's going to end up. He has no basis for knowing where it's going to end up. Some will invoke the idea of divine foreknowledge or predestination, but it's hard to hold to those doctrines if you say that God is not also sovereign and in control of what's happening in nature and what is going to happen into the future. So an arguably more logically consistent position, if you start with the premise that God is not guiding the process, is to say he also doesn't know where it's going to end up. And when you then affirm that, you're really to open theism. That is another way of describing open theism. So there is a connection between certain forms of theistic evolution, not all, but certain forms of it do lead to the open theism perspective theologically.
Well, I would say to my friends in the Evangelical Theological Society that we recognize that the issue of theistic evolution is focused on Genesis 1 to 3 and the question of whether these chapters should be understood to be historical narrative, reporting events that actually happened. We argue in this book that it is not to be taken as poetry, it should not be taken as allegory. It's not a story of archetypal everyman that just represents the truthfulness about the human race rather than about specific individuals, Adam and Eve. We're saying that Genesis 1 to 3 is not ancient Near Eastern myth with no attempt to report actual events. We're saying it's not a creative retelling of Israel's history, rather that it is trustworthy historical narrative, anchoring the subsequent history of the entire Old Testament and confirmed as historically truthful and reliable by 10 different New Testament books. I would say it's important to reject the theory of theistic evolution because it really threatens the truthfulness of the Bible. I think if we deny the historicity of the narrative about Adam and Eve in Genesis 1 to 3, we're denying the inerrancy of Scripture. And that's not all that's at stake. These first 3 chapters of the Bible are tremendously important because these chapters provide the historical foundation for the rest of the Bible and for the entirety of the Christian faith. That means that the debate about theistic evolution is also about the validity of several major Christian doctrines for which these 3 chapters are foundational. Because if we think for a minute, in Genesis 1 to 3, Scripture teaches us essential truths about the activity of God in creation, the origin of the universe, the creation of plants and animals on the earth, the origin and unity of the human race, the creation of manhood and womanhood, the origin of marriage, and the origin of human sin and human death, and man's need for redemption from sin. Without the foundation laid down in these 3 chapters, the rest of the Bible would make no sense, and many of those doctrines would be undermined or lost. So I think it's no exaggeration to say that these 3 chapters are essential to the rest of the Bible. It's important to recognize what is actually happening in the debate over theistic evolution. Our friends who hold to theistic evolution are claiming, in essence, that there are whole areas of human knowledge about which they will not allow the Bible to speak with authority. They will allow the Bible to speak to us about salvation, about miracles, about the life and death and resurrection of Christ, but they won't allow the Bible to speak to us about the origin of all living things on the earth, about the origin of human beings, about the origin of moral evil in the human race, and the origin of human death, and the origin of natural evil in the world, and the perfection of the natural world as God originally created it. And even to speak to us about the nature of Christ's own personal involvement as the creator of all things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, Colossians 1:16. Now, these are massive areas of human knowledge. They affect our outlook on our entire lives. Yet theistic evolution has decreed that the Bible cannot authoritatively speak to us about these areas of human knowledge. These topics, they say, are the exclusive domain of modern naturalistic scientists, and they're off limits for God to speak to us about. But do Christians today really want to accept a theory that decrees that God is not allowed to speak to us about these entire vast areas of human knowledge? Finally, there's another question for Christian leaders. If theistic evolution requires a denial of so much of the historicity of Genesis 1 to 3, is it really an acceptable position for people entrusted with leadership and teaching responsibilities in churches and parachurch organizations today?